Welcome. I'm Susan Cohen, the coordinator of the New York Botanical Gardens Landscape Design Portfolio Series, which we have presented each fall since 1998. We're very glad you can join us tonight. I'd like to remind you that tomorrow, Tuesday, October 19th, Daryl Morrison will be speaking live and in person at 1 p.m. in Ross Hall, and it is not too late to register for his presentation. Also, I'd like to give our warm thanks to the Heimbolt family. And Monica Heimbolt, I know you are watching. The New York Botanical Garden appreciates your generous and longstanding support for this series. Thank you. Before we begin, 2 notes. 1, closed captions are enabled for this lecture, and you can use the CC button in your controls to show or hide the captions. And 2, if you have a question for Michael, please place your questions in the Q&A module, not in the chat. Otherwise, we won't really have access to it or look for it. The Q&A module is accessible, as you know, in your Zoom controls, and we do hope you have questions. So be sure to do that. Now, to introduce our speaker, Michael Boucher, a fellow of the American Society of Landscape Architects, who founded his own office, MBLA, in Freeport, Maine, in 1994. Michael received his master's degree in landscape architecture from the Harvard Graduate School of Design, but even before entering Harvard, he had degrees in both plant and soil technology and environmental design. So you might say he was very well-grounded to become a landscape architect. A teacher as well as a practitioner, Michael is especially known for his collaborative practice, and he has led teams of architects and engineers, horticulturalists, and other professionals to design projects, some at a very large scale, that include universities, parks, museums, and churches. But Michael is also known for his outstanding residential landscapes, especially those in challenging settings. And I asked him to focus on these today. I know we all look forward to seeing these projects. His topic is enduring landscapes. Please join me in welcoming Michael Boucher.
Thank you, Susan. I have to hello to everyone, whoever and wherever you are. Thank you for joining us. And I apologize for the frog in my throat. Hopefully it will leave. I was flattered by Susan's invitation to join this program, and I'm really honored to be here. I know a lot of you have backgrounds in design yourselves, and I hope you'll spare me the embarrassment of any specialized horticultural questions. My office, as Susan said, we're a collaborative group. We're a small group. There's 7 of us, and we work primarily with modern architects around the country and in other countries. And it is that close collaboration that we enjoy so much. So when you see the work, I want you to think about several things. One is that we're working with really great architects on generally pretty amazing sites, and with very insightful and wonderful clients. And without all of that, what we do wouldn't be possible. The other thing is that, as I say, that we have a team, and this is not just me. It's a group that has evolved over time, and we work very closely together. Susan also mentioned we do a wide range of work. We've worked all over, not all over the world, but in many places in the world at all kinds of scales. And one of the things we enjoy most is going to new places and learning about that place, its climate, the cultural history, and what's going on, and how people build, and just the enjoyment of learning through that process. And so today we'll look at a handful of house residential projects, which is the first time I've done this. But I tried to choose residences that cover a range of different situations. And throughout all of these, we tend to favor the use of local plants and other materials, building materials. We pay special attention to transitional zones and edges, which I'll talk about a little bit. And we aspire to create quiet, practical and enduring landscapes, not necessarily looking to show off or make events of everything that we do. So with that, take a look at what we have here. We're in Maine. This is one kind of rock garden, I suppose, here on the coast of Maine. One of the things I love about our profession is that it deals with the world in so many scales. And you know, I'm really interested in what the landscape does to itself and what it's doing to itself, which is something that one of my favorite professors, Laurie Olin, mentioned a long time ago, that the landscape is doing whatever it's doing, and we have to engage it in a reasonable and intelligent way. And this happens. Here's the Mississippi. You can see all the various places it's been and what it's done over thousands of years. And then the same thing is true at the micro scale. You know, there's a lot of energy in the landscape and how it fights for itself, and then, you know, footstep on the beach, things that are transitional, incidental, and change. Getting a lag here, I'm sorry. So we hear a lot about the inside and outside relationship with architecture and landscape. And this is an example of a chapel, a prayer pavilion project that we worked on in Arizona with the Barlow architects, which I feel is a very good example. Of course, this climate accommodates it better than others, but an example of how the indoors and the outdoors can work together. And that's true in residential design as well. What we don't hear a lot of talk about, I feel, is the then what. So in this little sketch, the pink area is the program. That's the landscape design. So that's what we do. And I like to say that what we do is fairly easy because we work with people and we have people who have ambitions and we help design and create those spaces. And then the green area is where to stop, particularly in natural areas. Where does one stop influencing the condition? How do you respond to the context? And to me, there are two ways to do this. One is, sorry, I've got a little lag. I haven't said that already. One is to blend into the context. We can't plant a forest, but we can plant the basis of a forest, as this wild sod example shows in a construction photo, and then blend the designed area into the native area. The other method that we try to employ is this one, which is to strike a very distinct line, an architectural line between the designed landscape and the native landscape. And that contrast, I find, is really quite compelling. And I'll have to admit, I really learned this from a client as well. And so we strive to include one of these methods or another in our designs so that there is either this distinct margin to the project or no trace of where the project started and stopped. The first house I'll talk about is in Telluride on this huge meadow. And I started working with the architects as they were developing ideas for the house. And one of the questions, of course, the first question was, where does this thing go? And that happened before we knew exactly what the house would be. Well, it's a very steep hillside. And the architects had a very good idea of where it should go. But after we did some site studies, the house evolved into a 3-level building and engaged the landscape in a certain way. The plan, which is the reverse of the view you just saw, which has arrival and parking at the top, and then you see these two sets of steps down to the home, which is an unusual approach. And then there are a series of kinds of spaces that relate to indoor rooms within the house all around this building. I'll show some of them to you. This is how the house is situated. And the idea here was to extend structural walls within the house as far out into the landscape as needed to be to work as kind of tentacles or to bolster the house and let it lock into the hillside. So it isn't just simply an object, but we're engaging the landscape in a way that the landscape and the house are tied together. Here's another view from down the way. And from above, we also planted hundreds of aspen from extending the edge of the native forest to help filter and settle the series of buildings into the landscape. So this sketch underscores what I mentioned before, which is how the structural walls, these dark lines, scribe elevational changes and make space in the landscape. So this I mentioned. So from the upper parking level, this is the arrival down into the first level of the home, which is the middle level of the home. And on the left, you'll see in a minute a courtyard that has very large boulders, and then there's a kitchen courtyard on the right. So these walls are somewhat incomplete. They're more like parentheses, and they're implied spaces, and they don't really completely capture any one of the courtyards. You'll see how they bleed out into the landscape. So here's the view from the entry looking back. We have a water feature here, which helps bring the sky and a sense of light to the entry. And here's a sneak into the Boulder Courtyard. We talked about boulders a lot, and I'll be honest, I'm not that fond of boulders here and there. And we discussed it. And I said, well, if we want boulders, let's get some boulders. And so I went to nearby area of some property that somebody had these stones available and walked around and chose these things. And then through tremendous effort and care of a very large crane and a bunch of people, these boulders were set into this courtyard. I'll just show you this quickly as a diversion. And so that was a lot of fun because this was doing something at a scale that was really quite unexpected. From within the house looking back, you can see again how the aspen trees help to layer the construction into the natural landscape. Back at the top of the stairs, we're peeking into the kitchen garden. And then from within, looking out. The difficulty with this house is it's hard to choose which way to look because it's encircled with amazing peaks. This is the upper level where there's the primary bedroom and offices of the owners. And there's a courtyard here just off of those buildings, which is the highest level above the three levels of the home. A glimpse of their sitting space here and this step. And I'm very fond of these kinds of things where this step, I think, is 5 by 9 feet. And I think one of the challenges in residential design is when elements are too small. And I'm interested in creating spaces, places to be, not just smaller objects. In progress, and this is to show, and I'll show this in another house later, how much of destruction there is on a project like this, and so how much either remediation and or embellishment is required to knit things back together. And here's a similar view. So at the left, we have a living space. The Midland Terrace is a spa, and then the office and bedroom wing to the right. The wall in the foreground is 113 feet long. So the scale of this is quite something. And in each case, you can see how the wall creates the space as the natural slope descends. And we like the little stuff. I was misspeaking before. We designed this fire pit here, and often do design elements like that, as well as furniture and other things. So here we're going to shift geography and scale quite a bit. Here's on Long Island, a very small lot and house on shore, and within some rather traditional, pinched between two traditional seaside homes, the site in our foreground. And this project was driven by, I should say, shaped by a lot of intense restrictions. Here's the plan. So from left to right, we have the brighter green square is an area of remediation to the natural landscape. You can see the lawns to the north and the south, but we were meeting the not only our own interests and the owner's interests, but the new codes. And then the compartment to the left of the house is actually, you'll see in the section, the septic system, which has to be protected from the potential force of hurricane storm action. And then the house and then the requisite beach access. To the right, you'll see the terrace and the swimming pool. So the section tells us the story. On the right is the point of arrival and the encapsulated septic. And then the car level, really that whole construction is a breakaway construction that's not otherwise occupied. And then the main living space is above that with the pool, and then bedrooms on the upper level with a courtyard I'll show you. Again, an example of very highly collaborative discussion with architects back and forth about how these indoor and outdoor spaces can take form. This is during construction as well, but it's the view from the saltwater marsh on the interior. Here's the arrival. So this has a garden-esque quality to it, although these are primarily native plants. Our philosophy is once you leave the ground, all bets are off, but as much as possible, try to adhere to what's going on around the project. Which is why I can't explain this lawn in the foreground, quite frankly, but we'll let that one go. This is the restoration of the native foreground from the point of arrival. And here's the septic system, which is also a very luxurious dog walk here. And from the beach. And then at the very top, there's a corridor one finds at the top of the stairs that envelops an open courtyard. And in the courtyard, we did a very simple thing here where there's a grid of pavers, which in the drawing on the right are white, and then the black areas are planted. And so on the right, there's an outdoor shower, the full width of the courtyard, which has a screen element. This is where the photo is taken from. And at the other end is 100% plants. So it's just this inverted checkerboard of things just as they were just planted. And here it is parked among the rest. All right, headed back west. We worked a lot in the Southwest with some pretty amazing architects there. This is a sizable property north of the city of Phoenix. And we were faced with this on the site, which was a kind of for me, a Bob Hope-esque kind of landscape, I guess, with a pretty fun AstroTurf putting green, which I have to say I was sad to see go, but it was just an amusing landscape. But the idea here was for a very serious house and serious architecture. and also a landscape that supported it, and then once again attempted to restore what had been taken away before when this was built. So the plan, and you can ignore the citrus orchard, which never happened, is a very, it's complicated for a reason. It's a very highly interwoven series of indoor spaces, outdoor spaces that are covered, but in part by the architecture, and then wholly outside spaces. And so there's a probably as good as an example of how far you can take a courtyard house in this kind of landscape. So this plan from top to bottom, there's a guest auto court, generous court, mostly for car movements, not because of lots of people. To the right here, there's owner's entrance and garage and parking spot. And then people enter through the central walk into a courtyard, which has kind of two personalities. One is it's the continuation to the main entry to the house. This is an enclosed corridor, and then in the cross axis, it engages this pool, and through a bit of trickery, we were able to do this without any obvious fences. And then there's a sitting area down at the desert level on the left, and then clockwise, a small morning court here, and then to the south, a series of spaces again that interlock with each of the indoor uses, and then transition out to the native landscape. So I'll show you some images of this. Here during construction on the left, you can see the form of the building, which I think helps you to read the drawing. And so filling in all the other structural elements are landscape design here. This is from within the courtyard looking back at the point of entry. And then the cross section, the two people together are entering the home, and then there's this upper level pool and lower level. Always focusing on space making here, not so much horticulture in this case. The water is up at this level, and then the sitting area is hidden below it, beyond. And the spaces to the south that I mentioned, you can see a little more clearly here. Several outdoor eating areas, different courtyards. Some are planted, some for seating under shade, and then the seating under this grand tree, but also the desert pokes in here several ways. So there's a kind of a same kind of in and out happening between the desert and the outdoor spaces. There is the outdoor spaces with the building itself. Here's that edge. And obviously, I think the materials, the architects and we worked very closely together on how these materials, how this stone would be treated. So there's the same stone throughout the project, but there's a number of sizes and patterns and textures, depending on the location and the juxtaposition of the landscape to the house. Okay, headed east again. This is a very interesting project, and it almost wasn't a project because we were contacted by this owner and sent a photograph like this one. And I said, oh my goodness, this is too hard. I don't know what to do here. But the person was so compelling, just very smart and engaging and really fascinated with design. And he talked us into it. And so we're really this is quite a challenge for me and for us, I think. The house is bigger than the hill that it sits on. The whole thing, in our opinion, was higher from the street than it was practical. And so everywhere you turned, you were faced with falling off a hill. And so after struggling for a while, and I should say this house was designed by the owner some maybe 20 or 30 years ago, and so it was undergoing a massive renovation and addition. You'll see. So here's the plan: the garage to the right and the house. And the concept here, by now you know that we like walls in the landscape. The idea here was to create almost an exploded foundation that sort of propped up the house, a harmonic of the house in a way, spatially, but by building these retaining walls, we created independent level areas around the house so that the spaces felt more settled. I'll show you how that turned out. The other aspect that you'll see was the house is very spare and quite beautiful. Here's just a drone shot, not very attractive season, but gives you a sense of how the place situated quite acutely. But it's a series of walls and ways to navigate this 20-something foot hillside. So the walls are simply bluestone, but in a number of tones. And then you can see they're cut in 3 different heights so that a matrix could be resolved in different combinations of them. And then to add to that, we decided to texture some of them. So there's 3 things going on here. There's the pattern of the lengths, there's the mix of the stone sizes, and then there's the texture of the stone knit through. So you'll see this throughout the project. At the arrival, then the walls all slip past each other. So every wall is an independent element. This is from near the front door. You see a bridge between the studio apartment over the garage and the main house. And then from the front door back to the street. Then these are all obviously early in the planting, but just renaturalizing the spaces between the occupied areas around the house. Here you get a better sense of how it's situated. This is a project that I would say is among one of my favorite projects, and it's because it really turned out as well as we imagined. It's not uncommon to put a lot into something and have it take a long time, and there are ways to be disappointed. But I visited this project several years ago, and which was probably 5 years after the fact, and I was just so pleased with how it happened, and the care and the investment these people have put into this. And I'm going to take my time because I see that I'm way ahead of schedule here. So, this is, as I mentioned early on, the combination of amazing architects, amazing clients, and amazing site. This is probably in the residential realm for us the height of those ingredients. It was quite an experience. So as we look at this, you'll see soon. But as we look at this image, everything within the foreground around this house was planted. This was a recreation of a forest. So the site, this is an interesting story because it has to do with protecting natural habitat. One is the site as presented to us, had been a combination of three different properties, and two of them had a focus of horses. And so there were barns and areas like this, corrals, that had essentially been bulldozed like a parking lot. And what had been here before, which is easy to see in the surroundings, was completely eradicated. And then there were several large homes as well. I'll show you the context here. This is blurry, but it's the best Google Earth could do for us. And so you see on the right, the very large home. The boundary of the property is approximately here on my cursor, but it's adjoining a larger parcel. It enjoys proximity to this beautiful creek, which you can hear from up on the hillside, and get down to several ways from where the house will sit. But you can see everything here was pretty much leveled by previous occupants. So in this, I'll do this just briefly, but so this is pretty much the same orientation. So the drawing shows if everything within the upper part of this drawing, if there's a circle, it's a new tree. So there were something like 1,900 trees planted on this property. And what we did to approximate what had been here were several things. One was to reshape the ground, and we did that. It took at least one of the 4 or 5 summers of construction just to shape the ground. So it's to reconfigure the surface of about 4.5 acres. Whoops. My computer's misbehaving. So the concept was to recreate this forest. And so we did a lot of exploring in the adjacent areas and measured tree spacing and density and tried to get a feel for what might have been here prior to anyone living on the site. We had to work also with the fact that there's a road going by, and so the darker trees here, evergreen, the firs, had to do with visual privacy and control of headlights traveling up and down the road. And then along the southern edge, or it's actually the eastern edge here, we're transitioning into the steeply forested, steep hillside, I should say. You can see these are 10-foot contours that are showing in that olive covered area down to the creek level. And so the idea was to create the privacy, create a context for this house, which is an amazing house. It's all clad in rusted steel, not Corten, but a treated, controlled rusting process, which is a whole lecture all by itself. And then to create a series of trails, and the trails give one a sense of travel. They let people wander from the home out into the landscape, into different environments. We created two distinctly different kinds of alpine meadows in 3 different situations, different locations. And the trails also connect to broader regional trails, so the family can hike and cross-country ski and right directly from the house. We have a very large loop driveway, and the idea here is that we wanted to be able to accommodate a lot of cars without it looking like that was the case, because they sponsor a lot of fundraisers and gatherings. I'll mention too, you see these stairs here in the landscape that head up the hill to the south, and then these do the same thing heading downhill to the north to these outer spaces. Now, what was interesting about this, I mentioned earlier, the sections show in the dashed line the existing condition of a parking or corral, and we're in agreement with the owners that we would try to recreate this natural environment to the best we could. And we had a wonderful landscape contractor, by the way, who really was essential to this happening. But the code restricted the either cutting or filling the land by 30 inches. That was the minimum. That was the maximum. I'm sorry, that was the maximum cut or the maximum fill. And at the scale of this site and this landscape, that was grossly inadequate, and the scale of this home, totally inadequate to achieve what we were talking about. And so we mused about this a bit and realized that the code was intended to implicitly to protect natural areas. Nobody who wrote this protective code anticipated protecting a parking lot or a corral. And so with the help of a land use attorney, the county planning office actually agreed to amend the code to specifically address the protection of natural areas rather than just to bluntly restrict the movement of earth. And that freed us up to do an awful lot more with this site than would have been allowed. And so that was a kind of interesting sidebar for us in the process. From the loop road through the middle of the loop, we're standing near the front door of the house, is the extra parking. And you can see we just dragged the aspen forest down the hill and created a transition of understory of grasses and clover to tuck this house, if a house this big can be tucked, into the hillside, and to help it feel anonymous. Frankly, the uphill side of this house is rather mute. It's largely opaque, and yet the back and downhill sides of it are mostly glass. And so it's not a showy piece of architecture. It's quite distinctive, but it's quite private. This is the point of arrival. The rest of the house from this side, which is a very long house, and then there's a garage and guest caretaker's unit, all very staid. And so this is an example of, I like to say that we organize weeds of the native meadow. We worked with the county and the landscape contractor on this. We also had to work with local agencies on wildfire issues. That having a plate steel house helped relax some of that, but they're still interested in the common fuel topics that Western areas have to deal with. Here's the house during construction. And so you can see the loop drive on the left. You can see where it might be, where all the activity is. And then around the house each room has a terrace in both directions. This is all the crafting of the architect. And then we added the terrace at the base, which is at the larger guest room. And then the house, which continues in the back, fronts the edge of this embankment, which leads down to the creek. This is also a good example of the level of change that's required to do this, which means all of the grading, all of the soil in the soil matrix for the different things that were happening, and then the introduction of a pretty rich mix of meadow plantings, the aspen, and the native conifers. As much as possible, I'm going to go back just for a second, as much as possible too, it's hard to appreciate in this photograph, we tried to protect what was there. But again, a lot had been destroyed just in the previous inhabitation. These are the Granite Steps. And that's what they look like, again, after the magical people come and tie things together. This is a view down the steps we were just looking up at, that lower terrace hiding behind the trees, and then the long face of the house headed to the north and down to the lower area. Another, I mentioned the clients, the site, the architect. Another really wonderful thing about this project is we collaborated directly with 3 sculptors, Ugo Rondinone, Mark Handforth, and Jim Hodges, which was a lot of fun. They were all great to work with, and I learned a lot from each of them, but also they had fun, I think, because some of this work had been previously considered to be gallery work, and we made up stories about how it could enhance this property and people's experience meandering about. I didn't ask my wife's permission, but here she is with me visiting. This is at the uphill of the river edge. An example of the trails. It's important when doing trails like this that they be wide enough for 2 people to walk without thinking about it, but not so wide that it looks like a park pathway, and not so beautifully curvaceous as they look like Olmsted did it. They should feel somewhere, I think, more like a trail, but function well. So along this series of paths, people start to find these sculptures, these sort of synthetic scholars stones that Ugo did, and we set them up in a way that as one's traveling around the pathway, you see one of them, and then as you go into another sequence of curves of the path, 2 of them are revealed, and then it isn't until you get to this certain spot that all 3 of these work together in a composition. It's possible the path comes very close to this one, but not close to the other one. So we try to make as much of a mixed experience with these pieces. And by traveling the path in the other direction, it changes everything, where you see the 3 together at one time and then move on, and they disappear. And one of Jim Hodges' beautiful boulders. And this is an example. I use this slide to remind myself to say that it's important to not do too much, I feel. And so there's a point where you get just enough, and then it's important to put the pencil down and let the context take over. Those are 5 houses.
Michael, thank you so much. Let me see if we have questions before I open the Q&A. I was struck by the amount of collaboration that must have gone on, not only between you and the architect and other professionals, but it was really a 3-way dance among you and the architect and the client. And I would think there's quite a difference between working for a residential client on projects like these, which were major long-term construction projects, and working for institutions. And I wonder if you could maybe talk a little about that, the difference between working with residential projects and corporate or institutional clients. Is there a difference?
Well, there's a huge difference. And I think the biggest difference is, well, first of all, we don't do lots. I shouldn't say we do. We're doing more and more commercial, more and more hospitality and development kinds of work. And when the ambition of a project, regardless of how nice everyone wants it, when the driver is to make money, that's a different thing than these homes I'm showing you. The goal wasn't to spend money, but it is someone treating themselves. And so it might even be the same person who, is tough on the development side, and then more generous in at home. But so the big thing is it's incredibly personal, and you've learned things about people that, you know, that's incredibly private. And it's important to learn those things so that we can be responsive. The other thing about residential design is another category of the emotional, how it's emotionally charged. And one is some people may be building their first house. You know, they've never been a client. They don't know their job as a client. And so you need to help them learn their role in the team, you know, with an architect, a landscape architect, and all the other people that help us, lighting and so on. And to bring them along so that they can contribute to that design process. And there are other clients who may have built several houses, or many in some cases, but maybe this is their last house. And so there's a lot that I've noticed go into those homes where, like, well, we're not going to have this chance again, or we've always wanted one of those. And those can become supercharged with, you know, trying to capture all of that. And so there's always a high degree of emotional involvement that is a different service, different kind of work effort other than the design, to help those things, those projects be realized.
As a follow-up, how do architects find you? Do you find yourself working over and over again with the same small group of architects, or how do they discover you usually?
Well, I have a very keen interest in modern architecture. So we were fortunate enough to work with a couple of pretty notable people early on. It turns out, I always say this is how I fell into the wrong crowd. A lot of these kind of studio scale and inventive architects are friends with each other. And so that referral opportunity was really helpful early on. The downside of that is if you don't follow through, that word spreads pretty quickly too. So we were very fortunate, frankly, to both have these early opportunities, but also because I think we were a good fit. We learned a lot, and so we tend to bring things to architects that they seem to appreciate. How I'm sure there are many other landscape architects that do this too, but it's we kind of we get involved in the architecture. Frankly, we try to help people work, you know, have their buildings fit the ground and fit the place. We put out all kinds of, you know, boring things in front of them when we start, like driveways and septic systems and all the fire truck and all the stuff nobody wants to talk about, so that later those things don't ruin a good project. So we bring in a practical sense. We try to understand the DNA of a building and how we might translate those ingredients into some landscape expression. I used to say what we do is we try to finish the project the way the architect would if they could design a landscape. And so it's sort of like playing rhythm guitar. You know, we're there to help the whole thing fit together and be knit together without. We're not the lead singer. We didn't write the song, but we can help keep those people honest too sometimes.
There are a couple of questions that have come up about plant material and soil, and I don't know how anxious you are to answer them. A simple one was, how tall do the aspens grow in that area, in the areas you were planting them at maturity? I know I've seen some very large ones at Telluride, very tall.
They grow very, very tall, and I don't know exactly how old they are when that happens, but they tend to, as that forest matures, you know, and as I understand it, it grows as an organism. It's like fungi in a way, and there's somebody out there flinching because they know more about it than I do, I'm sure, but the forest thins itself over time as it matures. That's what I've observed. And so they get very, very tall. They can get very tall. I don't know exactly all the factors as to where they do and don't, wind, elevation. A lot of the two projects near Telluride and near Aspen, that house is in the 8,400 or 500 feet maybe. In Telluride, we've done 3 projects at well over 9,000 feet. The conditions are harsh. And so how tall an aspen tree just is the same as how tall does anything get? It depends on how hospitable the environment is, I think.
And a related question is about soil. And I wonder, these are specific questions. Did you test and decide to use existing topsoil, amend all of those things about amending soil? Did you have soil scientists on most of those jobs with you, or do you do that in your office?
Sort of neither. We use soil scientists on urban projects. We're not caught up with a lot of really established firms that traditionally typically use them in other. At the other end of the spectrum, though, we lean heavily on very professional contractors, and we use their wisdom, and their experience and what they're comfortable with. And they bring a lot of science to it. It may not be the same as the formality of engaging one of the firms we might use on a street planting project, but there's some thought into it, particularly in a project like, let's say, the last one I showed, where we had to rebuild the geology in the sense, the layering of soils and drainage, and we should probably engage soil folks more than we do, and yet we do collaborate with the installers and respect their opinions.
And most of those, I assume, are local and have local knowledge and have done this for maybe a generation.
Thank you. Yes, they know what they're doing, and they're guaranteeing it, and they are looking out for their own future livelihood as well.
One question actually resonates with me because I wondered what you would say to this. It's about when you put the pencil down. And I think even when we were all in design school, that was always an issue. How much more do you do? When is it enough? And is that instinct now with you? Or do you have to remind yourself? Do you have to look back and say, no, erase that last bit? Or I'm going to do one more thing. So how does it work? If you were to try to think back to that project where you talked about putting the pencil down, can you recreate that particular setting for us?
I don't know that would answer your question, but to answer your question, it is, I don't know if it's instinct as much as it's habit. We're always trying to see how little we can do. And so we tend to thrash our projects before, to a point that we think they're distilled to whatever is essential. Now that isn't necessarily what, minimum. What's the minimum? We aren't minimalists by any intention, but I use the word essentialist, where it needs to feel good. It needs to be authentic to me and be believable. And then I think the question is how much, and this is a criticism I have, frankly, of urban projects these days, many, that they become spectacles. And I'm more interested in creating spaces that people can experience what's happening. And obviously in natural settings, that's a different thing than in a city. And yet I just find too many things they're just too full. It's like a living room with way too many chairs and hassocks. And so we're more interested in space making The other thing to pay close attention to, I think, is that the scale outdoors, we all know this, we're all trained in this, that the scale is very different than inside. And so it's to not be afraid to make something that someone might think is too big, and to get out on the site and stake things out. And someone will say, oh, I thought that was big, and it's not big at all. And so paying attention to scale will help keep the frivolity out of a design. We like budget cuts. That helps keep extra stuff out of designs too. And then ease in construction. Why make it difficult for people to build something? Keep it as simple. I mean, designs can still be rich and enduring, and but be simple. So it's a way we work. And certainly early on, I did way too much, and I learned it when I didn't have very much work. If you don't have very much work, you tend to just keep, cooking, and it's silly. And I think too, now that I'm old, I have more confidence to just say to people, look, this is all you need. We're not here to entertain. We're here to get to the right answer. And so I just think of it as more, what is the right space? How do you make a space that people can feel comfortable in, whether it's by themselves or with other people, and don't create distractions from that experience.
Have you ever had a client, unlike the ones that you seem to have now, who respect the kind of vibe that you're creating for them, who come and say, well, yes, but I want color? I mean, I know all of us have had people who've said, oh, that looks nice. Well, where's the color?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure.
Okay, so how do you convince people that maybe they don't need color, a pot of flowering petunias or something? Because how do you do that, or don't you? Or do you find a way to find a place for that spectacular pot of annuals?
I think you find a place. I mean, it's not my house. Okay, it's someone's house. So, and yet they did call, and so we will be, clear about our view. If someone calls because they like what we've done, we did it without their help. So we can work together. And again, I think the rules for us are, if it's on the ground and in the ground, it ought to be of the ground. And if color can come in a bed, and let's even lawns, honestly, to us, need to have an edge. There, a lawn is a potted plant. It's not default maintenance. It's a potted plant within a natural environment. So that lets lots of things happen. Once you get up onto a terrace, then it's not connected to the ground anymore, and it can be more playful and more like furniture and more like textiles. And so I think there's always ways to do that. Now, in the end, generally, that is a comfortable conversation, because generally people who call us didn't see that. We've had several projects, a number of projects, where people say, this is what we want. And then we hire a garden designer, say, here's your garden. It's 12 by 80 and we need a garden. I don't know how to do that. Don't ever, please, any of you call me for that. I don't know how to do it. But there are people who are really good at it. And so we think of that as a specialty, almost like having an artist work on a project, to bring people in that are expert in that.
So here's one last one. I like this. You show different terrains, mountains, desert, beach. Do you have a favorite? So what if you had to pick one right now, what would be your favorite terrain or location? Where would you put your house?
Well, I have two. Yeah, okay, that's a different one.
All right.
I like going from place to place, and I like the challenges and the reminders of how the desert reminds me about other conditions, and how the mountains remind me. So it's the involvement in all those places that are so enjoyable. I enjoy what I think of as a kind of eastern subalpine condition. I'm from Maine, I'm from eastern Maine, where it's more granite than plants, and the plants are in the cracks, and it's a sort of arid arid, spare. So there's a sparity and an earnestness and tenacity about that landscape that I really like in all the seasons. Where I would put my house, I'm very social, and I'd like to live near other people. So I would never live in any of the places I just showed you. Not that I could, but that's a different question. I don't know that. And
Right.
I have favorite landscapes that I connect with, and I think that's frankly from my childhood. What I really think, I've been realizing more and more that the landscape that I know is the one that I laid on the ground and poked sticks in the ground, not the one I studied. And so try to translate that to these different places and try to get a sense of what it must have been like to poke around in those places as a kid.
One last comment from somebody who is watching. Thanks for everything. Very interesting. From Peru, watching. I thought that would be a wonderful place to end. So thank you to all of you out there, including our friend in Peru. And thank you, Michael.
Thank you all. I appreciate you giving us an hour.
Take care, everyone.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Good night.